Support for NPR and the following message come from Indeed. You just realized your business needed to hire someone yesterday. Speed up your hiring right now with Indeed. Claim your $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/NPR. Terms and conditions apply.
So heads up, this episode contains some salty language and reclaimed slurs. Hey everyone, you're listening to Code Switch. I'm B.A. Parker, and today I'm joined by longtime Code Switch producer, Jess Kung. Hey Jess.
Hi Parker.
All right, what you got for us today?
Okay, so we know we've kind of discussed on the show in various ways before that transness has become a huge symbolic issue. And now, in the second Trump administration, trans people's access to space, medical care, dignity are all caught up in a continuous legal tug-of-war.
Oh, I am aware.
The High Court just ruled to uphold Tennessee's ban on gender-affirming care for minors. It's a stunning setback to transgender rights.
New this morning, applicants for U.S. passports can once again select the gender that matches their identity, at least for now. A federal judge blocked the Trump...
Your population doesn't want men playing in women's sports, so you better comply, because otherwise you're not getting any federal funding. Every state, good, I'll see you in court. I look forward to that. That should be a real easy one.
Well, Parker, as transness increasingly becomes a shorthand for political outrage, I've been thinking a lot about how that term, trans, flattens a really diverse population. And the term trans people of color is almost more frustrating.
In what way?
I mean, I think the term tends to be thrown out as this broad gesture that obscures much more specific concerns about trans misogyny, classism, all that. I'm a trans person of color, and so is Laverne Cox, and so are a lot of the kids who just lost their ability to access gender-affirming care across the country. And I struggle with how useful it is to place me and her and all of them in the same bucket in that way, you know? What do we actually have in common versus our substantial material differences?
Are you asking me? Because I'm very careful about what my lane is.
We love it. Queen of staying in her lane. But it's okay. Yeah, it's not on you. I think I found a pretty good place to explore this question.
My name is Caro de Robertis, and I'm a writer, primarily a novelist, but my new book is So Many Stars, an oral history of trans, non-binary, genderqueer, and two-spirit people of color.
So Many Stars consists of 20 interviews that Caro de Robertis did with trans, non-binary, genderqueer, and two-spirit people of color. They're my elders, they're mostly baby boomers, and they're just telling their own stories in their own words.
There was this gang of butch Asian women that I hung out with, and we called ourselves the Sticky Rice Gang. And we would play mahjong all the time. It sounds like a bad stereotype, but we really did do that.
I was still being seen as masculine more. And I remember having a white trans male friend of mine say to me, "Isn't the privilege amazing?" And my immediate response was, if you mean I'm even more likely to get pulled over and shot, I'm not feeling it.
You know, I came to drag performance or dressing like a woman at a late age, 59 years old. And, you know, I will say that the reason I waited so long was I wanted to live.
Whoa, okay, who are they?
They are Chino Scott Chung, Fresh Lev White, and Donna Persona. We're going to hear their voices and other voices from De Robertis' interviews scattered throughout the rest of this episode. I think hearing from this slice of this generation, you know, people who've been trans people of color long, long before that became the acceptable term, and I've been out longer than it's been the acceptable term, it does really help put things in context. And hearing them together in this book did create this constellation a view of all these disparate lives pulled towards the same center of gravity.
So today on the show, Jess is going to metaphorically stargaze. Let me live. It's going to stargaze with Caro de Robertis. I'll get out of the way.
This message comes from Smalls. Started back in 2017 by a couple of guys home cooking cat food in small batches for their friends, Smalls cat food is protein-packed recipes made with preservative-free ingredients you'd find in your fridge, and it's delivered right to your door. Give your cat the food they deserve. For a limited time only, because you are a Code Switch listener, you can get 60% off your first order and free shipping by using code CODESWITCH. This message comes from Carrier, committed to providing climate and energy products and services to help enhance lives. More information is at carrier.com. Carrier, for the world we share. This message comes from Charles Schwab. When it comes to managing your wealth, Schwab gives you more choices, like full-service wealth management and advice when you need it. You can also invest on your own and trade on Thinkorswim. Visit schwab.com to learn more. Support for NPR comes from the Wallace Foundation, an independent, nonpartisan research foundation collaborating with grantees and partners in the arts, school leadership, and youth development. More at wallacefoundation.org.
I started by asking Caro de Robertis about the title of this project, So Many Stars.
As a novelist, I have often gone through what seems like hundreds of titles before landing on the right one for the book. With this particular project, I knew what I wanted the title to be before I even started writing. When I was still gathering interviews, I was sitting in front of Crystal Mason at their house and interviewing them. And I asked them a question about what it was like for them to adopt they-them pronouns in their 60s.
I just feel like if you lay under a night sky, right? Like not in the city, out in the woods somewhere, which I rarely do. I don't go out in the woods very often. But, when you do, right, you see the sky full of stars, right? So many. And there's like so many more that, that's not even in your sight, right? And when I think about that, I think about all those stars as possibilities. So I think like new words, new understandings, it also creates possibility, which translate on a very micro level to there might be then one less person who doesn't feel alone, who feels like they're not singular.
I was just listening to them and I was so utterly inspired by this vision. And I thought that it was truly revolutionary and also right and beautiful. And I thought to myself, I can imagine this as a title for a book that gathers these voices if I could ever pull that off.
With that expansiveness in mind, the subtitle of this book is Oral History of Trans, Non-Binary, Genderqueer, and Two-Spirit People of Color. That's a lot of expansive terms, and yet it's sort of like a lot and maybe not enough. Like there's so much negotiation you have to do with this language. I don't know. How did you kind of think that through?
It is a lot and also not enough. That is absolutely right, because there are other terms that some of these 20 narrators identify with that are not in the subtitle. Like transmasculine, for example, is the primary gender term for KB boys.
As the different decades I've lived through, the names have changed, but I've always felt that I've always fought just to be me. And that's not necessarily being a trans man, but if you must label me, I think that is the most apt, a transmasculine being.
Initially, I thought of the subtitle, An Oral History of Trans and Gender Nonconforming People of Color. Because gender nonconforming is a good umbrella. It's a good way to kind of talk about us in an expansive way. Very clearly includes butch people, for example. And at the same time, what I got to having conversations with lots of trans and non-binary friends was that, nobody really loves that term as their primary term, right? And some people will even say, well, what do you mean non-conforming? I am conforming perfectly to my own gender. I am in alignment with my true gender. So conforming to what? No term is perfect. Again, this is why we proliferate language. But I decided to sort of move away from that umbrella and try to just capture some of the valences of possibility in 4 words that at least the 20 narrators in the book each identify with at least one of the terms in this subtitle, even if they also identify with other words. And it did feel important to include genderqueer, even though in younger generations, that's a less common primary gender term. For some of these elders, that's the word.
I'm not quite sure where the first time I saw genderqueer or where that came up, but I felt that word was like fit like my feeling and my self-vision.
At the time, genderfuck was what the term was in like club kids. And that's what I understood. Oh, yes, I am genderfuck. And genderqueer is now was an acceptable version of genderfuck. But that's what I am.
I have such a deep, deep love of the term genderqueer. And I do identify personally as non-binary, partly in order to be more legible around my gender to mainstream spaces, cis spaces, and also queer younger spaces and trans younger spaces. But it almost does feel like an act of translation. And I'm also a literary translator, so I think about language in that nerdy way, where in older generations, genderqueer was it's almost like that's the granddaddy of the word non-binary.
I mean, keeping on language, you mentioned that you have been a literary translator. And for these interviews, some of them were conducted in Spanish or Spanglish. For you, how is talking about transness and gender different between English and Spanish?
So when I interviewed Bambi Salcedo, who is an absolute icon, she's the founder of the Trans Latina Coalition and still its executive director. I went to her offices to do the interview because she's very, very busy. She's like, you need to come to me. Absolutely. I fly to LA, I go to her. And she wouldn't sit down to the interview until she'd introduced me to every single Latina trans woman who worked in that office. And I noticed that I had this gender euphoria from just introducing myself because pleased to meet you is a gendered thing in Spanish. And that made me aware of how when people spoke in Spanish during their interviews, they made choices about how to gender themselves in childhood. And there's something so powerful about, in English, pronouns are something we ask others to give to us, gendered pronouns. But in Spanish, our adjectives for ourselves, you don't just say, I'm tired. You're like tired in a feminized or masculinized or gender neutral way, cansado, cansada. And then the gender neutral cansade is a new neologism and innovation. So it marks you, as queer, just to say, estoy cansade. And when people spoke about themselves in their childhood and gave their child self the gender that felt true to them, it just felt so incredibly powerful. To hear people speak of themselves as a little girl, knowing the world was reading them as a little boy at that same time.
Bueno, de hecho, el nombre de Bambi se generó porque cuando yo estaba chica, o chico en ese tiempo, ¿no? Yo jugaba fútbol.
And then it was also really beautiful for me to be able to speak with people about their own relationship to language. Like, again, with Bambi Salcedo, she has said this in many interviews. She says to crowds, we should own our joteria. And joteria is a kind of untranslatable word. It's Latino, but it's also Mexican in particular. And it's somewhere at the intersection of like sissiness and faggotry, right? So it's both to be a joto is to be an overly feminized male, but all supposedly overly, right? That is very much in quotation marks. The sort of the sissy element, but also the gay male element, but it's also kind of a slur you could use against trans women, right?
To me, it's like joteria is not just one meaning, right? Like it's just a compilation of beautiful and amazing things, right? That it's our strength, it's our beauty, it's our intelligence, it's our organizing, it's our love. We should own our joteria.
When she says own our joteria, take this word that has been used to denigrate and claim it. She's doing it within a cultural context, and she's evoking something so particular.
In this book, I feel like the realities of political fights for trans rights, for the rights of trans people of color specifically, they are like rendered very vividly by these storytellers. And I feel like what I was tracking that you kind of were getting into as language expanded was that these people like kind of lived through the development of trans as a kind of term to identify with and organize around. Did you see this shift over time and how people's gender identities and political identities developed with this new language?
Yes, I think that's a really incredible point. These are people who absolutely were born before that was genuinely a lexicon, even in queer community and queer spaces, which weren't even called queer spaces, right? There's people in there, like Native American magnificent drag queen Land O'Lakes, who remember...
When I was in college, I used to belong to the GLA, the Gay and Lesbian Alliance. Back then it was just GL. That was the whole community at the time. It was GL.
There can be the perception from individual people and also from the formal archive that there was no trans rights organizing before the language appeared. But people have always been, doing that advocacy everywhere. And it's often something that's embedded in people's personal stories, in their personal journey of how they rose up and made a life, and also how they engaged in activism that generated change.
Most of the people who ended up in this book were featured because of their public or community work. It looks all kinds of different ways. I mean, this is the generation that lived through the AIDS crisis. Nikki Calma was doing safe sex education for the Filipino community by performing in clubs.
There's this grandioso piano music. Dun, 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 dun. Hola, mi amigos, mi amigas. Yeah. My name is Tita Ida, and I am your hostess with the moistest tonight, things like that. Well, I am here to help a fellow Filipino man about issues in condom use, things like that.
The work ranged from institutional to interpersonal. There are all of these stories of stumbling into gaps in various systems, like the one Josenyo Lewis tells.
Oh, gosh. It was in the 90s, I think the mid-90s. I was part of a group that would go to Washington, D.C. to lobby for trans inclusion in anything, but especially around medical care. Specifically, the amount of times that I had to go to the Human Rights Campaign's office and try to convince the people in charge at that time that trans people were a part of the queer community and we did need to be represented, and we were not asking for quote unquote special rights. And how dare you turn around and tell us that we are asking for special rights when that is exactly what you grew up hearing all of your life, when you just said, I just want to be able to rent an apartment. I want to be able to have a job. I want to be able to marry the person that I care about. I want to be able to have children and not have to worry about custody issues.
Coming up, more from all these stars.
Stay with us.
Support for NPR and the following message come from Betterment, the automated investing and savings app. CEO Sarah Levy shares why they provide tools and technology for retail investors, small businesses, and independent investment advisors.
At Betterment, there is one unifying idea, which is the idea of expanding access. Historically, great financial advice was reserved for the wealthy, and what technology has done is basically lowered the barrier to entry and created an on-ramp for people earlier in their financial journey to get access to great advice. The same is true for small businesses, where mid and small-sized businesses have not historically been able to afford a retirement solution for their employees. So again, Betterment's technology allows smaller and smaller companies to attract the best employees. And then lastly, for financial advisors, what we've done again is expanded access by automating and using the scale that technology can provide.
Learn more at Betterment.com. Investing involves risk. Performance not guaranteed. This message comes from LinkedIn Ads. Target your buyers by job title, company, role, and skills with LinkedIn Ads. All the professionals you need to reach in one place. Get a $100 credit on your next campaign at linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply.
This message is sponsored by Udemy. If you're looking for new ways to get ahead, then you're Udemy's kind of person. Udemy helps learners like you upskill in AI, productivity, leadership and management, and more. Learn at your own pace from real-world experts. You can also prep for certifications that show employers what you know. Upskill for the career you want at udemy.com.
Parker.
Jess.
Code Switch. Jess has been talking to the author, Caro de Robertis, who wrote the book, So Many Stars, An Oral History of Trans, Non-Binary, Genderqueer, and Two-Spirit People of Color.
And Parker, it's kind of a pop truism now that queer and trans people have always existed. And yeah, definitely. But it is really nice to hear firsthand about previous generations of queer life in living memory. One thing I really relished about this book was learning about people's childhoods.
We had a term in high school that was what we used when somebody kissed a girl for the first time. And that was that you were wrecked. And this is what I started learning around that time. Soon after kind of all of this confusion and turmoil, inner turmoil, I was wrecked by this 22-year-old. And I orchestrated the whole thing. It was this whole scheme I cooked up. And in my mind, I was like, this is how I'm going to get wrecked. We are going to kiss behind the bushes. And that's how it happened. Like, it actually happened. And yeah, this person, I think I knew that she kind of cheated on her girlfriend a lot. So I was just like, well, okay, I'm going to add myself to that. It was May 22nd, 1987, by the way.
My mother had a sister who was a bull dyke, serious bull dyke, and who came to all of our family functions with her partner. They lived in an apartment with my aunt's kids, and nobody ever talked about it, but she and her partner was always at all of the family functions. She was part of our family. I don't know if she was really a role model because we never really talked. She was a visual point of reference.
When I started going into the clubs at 17, they let me in. Amelia's. And Amelia's was segregated as well. White people stayed downstairs, black people went upstairs.
When I started hanging out at the clubs and everything, this was in 71, 72, when I was, going into high school, and Donna Summers was hot, and I fell in love with Donna Summers. And we were meshing together. We were in community together because we were gay, we were queer, we were homosexuals. We would go to clubs that were off the beaten path.
I have always had queer elders and drawn on queer elders' wisdom and perspective and mentorship and kindnesses. I also think it's important to recognize that all of us have an incredibly rich inheritance from queer and trans elders, because trans and genderqueer people are less likely to grow up with that trans and genderqueer culture in their home, right? It's a culture that we're all part of as trans and queer people, but unlike our other cultures, it's less likely to be passed down in the home, right? Most people who are Latinx have Latinx parents and receive aspects of the culture at home. Not everyone. Adoption exists, lots of circumstances exist, but most people have that. With queerness and transness, I didn't have that in my home growing up. I grew up in a very homophobic and transphobic home, so I had to go out and find those things. And I did, and claimed that lineage, and that has given me life and set me free. Now my children, who are teenagers, are growing up in a home that is steeped in queer culture. And so that inheritance and that mirroring is present. But that's the minority. That's the minority still.
To me, it seemed like you're in a very unique position, having sat with all of these elders. And my understanding is that you are also engaged in these like queer spaces for youth. And I just, like, what do you, like, you learn from elders, but you also learn from youth. And I guess that's what I'm trying to ask. Like, what do you learn from young queer people, and what do you want for them?
So I actually learned to have full permission to be my whole gender in a way from youth, because it's the younger generations, including those who are currently still kids and teens, who are so good at helping themselves to whatever is true for them about their genders. I came of age in the 90s, and I came out in the 90s, and the categories of gender were more defined at that time in gay circles. And so I couldn't quite find a mirror for the way that what made sense to me in terms of my butchness and masculinity. And I also didn't find a path for myself in being a trans man. And so it really kind of took, of course, I was giving my kids all of this encouragement to be free, to be their whole selves. And then one day I was volunteering for a QSA at my child's middle school. And there was this table of pronoun stickers, and they were all there, ze, zer, and they, them, and she, her, and all, and all of them were there. And kids could take as many stickers as they pleased. And I was standing there encouraging them to take them, which they were helping themselves because they're young people, so they're just going to own it, right? They don't have the 90s hangups that we older folks have. And so I'm looking at this table and I'm watching these kids, and I all of a sudden had this crystalline thought. If this table had existed at my middle school, I would have been openly and outrageously genderqueer all my life. And as soon as I had the thought, I understood that I was, going to come out again in a new way. So my path to fully owning my gender queerness and my, trans masculinity really came through an experience I got learning from youth.
The experience of you can have it all is, to me, very culturally queer.
It is, isn't it? It's so culturally queer, yes. But I think, in the 80s and 90s, folks had to fight for that. And it wasn't always discernible in queer spaces like it should have been, to express a personal opinion. I think it should have been. And that kind of experience, that I am articulating from myself is also an experience that people testify to in the book, kind of looking for spaces where they could fully be themselves and sometimes getting resistance, right, from within queerness, right? Oh, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't do this, one example being trans men who transitioned in the early aughts, the late 90s and the early aughts, and, some of the members of lesbian community who were really resistant to that.
Some of the hardest conversations I had early on were with other butches who felt like they were being left behind or like they were feeling pressure to transition.
I had another butch who talked to me about wanting to transition. And I remember saying to them, why? Like, why do you need to? Because I was just like, I didn't know. And I was way into like, you're this beautiful butch.
Que eran más o menos lesbianas, in the butch lesbians. Hay como cierto, concepto de que o por ahí que no les gusta tanto la masculinidad, ¿me entendés? Entonces era como que, bueno, sí, vos podés ser butch, pero no trans, ¿no?
Kind of hurt my heart too, just to feel like people were feeling that way or that my transition had any bearing on them in a negative way.
I think the person that I saw myself most in and fell into very similar buckets to is Chino Scott Chung.
As I was growing up, we used to drive here to San Francisco because my dad loved the food. I mean, we all love the food.
But because of that, similarity, I felt a lot more friction with the things that were different about our experiences.
I actually joined the Army, and that one of the reasons why I joined was to come out. It was funny because indeed there were a lot of lesbians in the Army.
And maybe that was because of the projection that similarity allowed. But I think that's like what was so beautiful about the whole project is that I have very few models of people in the world with whom I can like grapple in this particular way. And I wanted to know if you felt those kind of connections too, and maybe those frictions as well.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm so glad to hear that Chino Scott Chung's journey spoke to you in some ways. And also, yes, there can be in some ways a different kind of grappling or a different level of grappling when we do have proximity or we do have resonance with a person's journey and experience. Each of these people, each of these narrators is really just being honest about their truth and journeys. And even as they are representing something, like Sharon Grayson is representing what it means to be a Black trans woman who transitioned in the 1960s.
I've had so many people tell me I've never seen a 73-year-old trans woman. I never knew that they existed.
You know, she certainly does represent Black trans womanhood. And at the same time, she can't represent all Black trans womanhood. Sharon, for example, had this incredibly supportive mom. You know, this lady from Houston who just loved her no matter what.
She wanted me to be happy, but she was afraid. But she knew, my mom knew who I was at heart, you know, and she never, ever tried to stifle that.
Well, there might be a reader who goes, that's really different from my story. And I think that is part of the power, again, of having a symphonic story, of having many different stories. Those of us who are so hungry for representation, that we will just look for it in all of these places, we really need mirrors of our experience. We often get a lot of windows, but we don't get enough mirrors, right? And so I think of a book like this as a space where we can hopefully each find little shards of mirror, you know, here and there in people's stories. And maybe no individual narrator's story will be like an exact perfect mirror of our experience, but it'll have little glimmers of places where we can see ourselves. Like Tupililea Arellano, trans Chicanx indigenous elder, has a moment where they speak to those of us who have fluid genders, trans fluid genders, are shapeshifters.
That's a medicine. You know, when I saw your picture, that's some intense shapeshifting. Yeah. And very powerful if we know how to use it, and you certainly know how to use it. No, it's a medicine. It's for us. It's for our safety, it's for our development, it's for our well-being.
And that's an example of a moment that I felt like I needed so much and I hadn't seen it for myself anywhere else yet.
So in this book, I think there's like some really incredible balancing of like euphoria and struggle. But, you know, reading through some of the harder stories, I thought a lot about kind of survivor bias. You know, as an umbrella, trans people of color are like not expected to live long. And the folks you talk to like sit with a lot of ghosts and like bring people with them. So I think this question's kind of impossible, but when you engage with the past like this, with these stories like this, how do you think about the voices who will not be able to be preserved in the same way?
This is a very profound question, and I'm so grateful that you brought it forward. Absolutely, the people in this book sit with a lot of ghosts. And I think one of the ways that we can harness oral history to fill the silences in the archive that are created by the absence of people who did not survive is by deeply listening to the people who did survive in the way that they honor those connections and those realities. So, you know, in the book, Donna Persona, for example, speaks to her very deep friendship with trans women. It Compton's cafeteria, who were part of the Compton's cafeteria riots, which happened in the late 60s and preceded Stonewall, and were kind of equally important to Stonewall in some ways in terms of being a pushback from trans women of color and queer folks, towards the policing of our communities.
By the way, little explanatory comma, the Compton's cafeteria riot took place in San Francisco's Tenderloin district in 1966. It was an eruption of tension between the police and the people who frequented Compton's, a 24-hour diner. Donna Persona was part of that scene in the 60s, before she was out as a woman, hanging out with those regulars, many of them trans women, drag queens, and/or sex workers.
It was like an Edward Hopper painting. When the first time, it was nighttime, and I'm walking the night, the sky is all dark, but Compton's is bright and lit. And outside of it, I saw these beautiful women. And they were dressed, like overdressed for 9 o'clock at night or 10 o'clock at night on the street. These women were wonderful people. They were so nice and they were so sweet. And they watched out for each other like you would not believe. And friends do that, but not like that. You know what I'm saying? We'd be in Compton's and one of the girls would come back. And I learned this, they kept looking at her and okay, her mascara isn't running, or her mascara is running. What happened? And they needed to know, how did it go? Friendships aren't always like that. So, I was seeing hyper friendships or super friendships. And, they did drugs, they slammed drugs. They did shoplifting. They shoplifted because it was against the law to buy women's clothes. Can you imagine? They never offered me any drugs. They never suggested that I do sex work. They never suggested that I paint my face. They just took care of me like a little family of their family.
And when we say, look how we've survived, look how we've come through, look how we've innovated culture, this is at great cost. And it's at great cost to our communities. And I think it is incredibly important to balance the gender euphoria, the joy, the revolutionary joy of being your whole self. All of those joys matter so much, especially in the context of the cost that our communities have paid and the grief that is with us. So I really did strive to hold all of those channels open simultaneously.
How do you think the voices from so many stars look to the future?
I think the elders in this book, they said they had so many kind, loving, and I think visionary things to say to younger trans and non-binary folks that I had to create a whole chapter that was just their messages, which is really just kind of a flood of love notes.
Oh, what they can know or see is that we're thinking of them and that we know that they're coming and that we are all in our own ways making way for them.
My hope is that you understand that you do have power and not just individual power, but also collective power, right? And we need to be able to exercise our power. We need to be able to change the structures that have marginalized us for many, many years.
Do you think that the queer at large are going to allow people to come and oppress them again? No. No, child. There's going to be somebody that's going to say, fuck that. Fuck off. Get off my dress. You know what I mean? I don't want you to oppress me.
Part of me feels like that's still the job of me and my generation, is to still try to do this work where we create the conditions that our young, gender nonconforming kids of color can live their best lives, whatever those lives may be. I mean, I don't want them to be cops or go into the army or nothing like that. But, but I want them to be able to live the lives that they imagine for themselves.
I believe that, it could happen, even if I don't get to see that, I believe that it will happen. And so my hope is what keeps me alive.
Caro de Robertis is the author of So Many Stars, an oral history of trans, non-binary, genderqueer, and two-spirit people of color. Caro, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute joy and honor to talk with you today.
Thank you. Thanks to the Baldwin Emerson Elders Project, which holds the publicly accessible archive for all these interviews and more. In alphabetical order, the voices are
Adela Vasquez,
Andres Osuna, Bambi Salcedo,
Miss Billy Cooper,
And Jobe Dugas,
Chino Lee, Scott Chung,
Crystal Mason,
Donna Persona,
Fresh Lev White,
Kali Boyce,
I'm Miko Thomas. I'm better known as Landa Lakes.
Nikki Kalma,
Sharon Grayson,
Storm Miguel Flores,
Tina Valentin Aguirre,
Tupili Lea Espinosa Ariano,
Joseño Vicente Lewis.
And that's our show. You can follow us on Instagram at NPR Code Switch. If email is more your thing, ours is codeswitch@npr.org.
And subscribe to the podcast on the NPR app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also subscribe to the Code Switch newsletter by going to npr.org/codeswitchnewsletter.
And just a reminder that signing up for Code Switch Plus is a great way to support our show and public media. And you'll get to listen to every episode sponsor-free. So please go find out more at plus.npr.org/codeswitch.
This episode was produced by me, Jess Kung. It was edited by Dalia Mortada and Leo Danella. Our engineer was Kwesi Lee. Special thanks to Hannah Chin.
And a big shout out to the rest of the Code Switch massive: Christina Kalla, Xavier Lopez, Courtney Stein, Verlyn Williams, and Jean Demby. I'm B.A. Parker.
I'm Jess Kung.
Hydrate.
Bye.
Support for NPR and the following message come from IXL Online. Is your child asking questions on their homework you don't feel equipped to answer? IXL Learning uses advanced algorithms to give the right help to each kid, no matter the age or personality. One subscription gets you everything. One site for all the kids in your home, pre-K to 12th grade. Make an impact on your child's learning. Get IXL now. And NPR listeners can get an exclusive 20% off IXL membership when they sign up today at IXL.com/NPR. This message comes from Mint Mobile. Mint Mobile took what's wrong with wireless and made it right. They offer premium wireless plans for less, and all plans include high-speed data, unlimited talk and text, and nationwide coverage. See for yourself at mintmobile.com/switch.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Rosetta Stone, an expert in language learning for 30 years. Right now, NPR listeners can get Rosetta Stone's lifetime membership to 25 different languages for 50% off. Learn more at rosettastone.com/NPR.